Good evening. Tonight, we're diving into a shadowy, forgotten, and dangerously fascinating corner of history. The world of assassins during the Middle Ages. Forget everything Hollywood has taught you. These weren't men in cloaks whispering deep philosophical lines before vanishing into the mist. They were shadows in alleys, blades rusted, motives murky. But before we get into it, take a moment to hit the like button if you enjoy what we do here. And subscribe, but only if you really want more stories like this. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is over there. I love seeing how far this midnight community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient noise, and prepare for a journey as raw as it is captivating. Let's get one thing straight. No one in the Middle Ages woke up thinking, I want to stab a nobleman today for a sack of coins and spend 3 days hiding under a pigsty. Becoming an assassin wasn't a dream. It wasn't a profession. It was what happened when your life slammed into a wall and left you no other way out. Most assassins weren't trained warriors from ancient monasteries or disciples of secret sections. They were broken people. Peasants pushed to the edge by famine. Soldiers abandoned after battles. Thieves who could walk through a market without a sound. Or those so invisible to society that they could take a life and vanish without leaving a trace in any ledger. If you had something worth protecting, land, a title, a goat, you might hire an assassin. But if you were someone recently out of jail, known for handling problems quietly, and good at slipping into taverns unnoticed, eventually someone would slide a bag of coins across a table and whisper a name. And no, it wasn't to get rid of the farmer who grew carrots peacefully in the valley. These were dirty jobs, a baron with too many enemies, a bishop hoarding gold, or someone protected by guards and surrounded by moats. The pay could sound tempting. But the job? It was vile. There were no benefits, no security, no breaks. No banner saying, discreet problem solver for hire. You had to be invisible, silent, and above all, mute. No one could know what you did. Not your friends, not your lover, not even the barkeep pouring your ale. You were a traveling carpet salesman. The stains? Oh, just wine. Being an assassin wasn't glamorous. You weren't a hero, and you weren't some grand villain in a saga. You were a footnote, an uneasy presence, a walking warning. And most of the time, you didn't live long enough to spend what you earned. Let's kill a big myth right now. Medieval assassins weren't trained under candlelight by wise old mentors while flutes played in the distance. There was no assassin school. No official training. You learned by failing and surviving. Every mistake you didn't die from was a lesson. Every scar was a diploma. If you had military experience, great, at least you knew how not to stab yourself. But most learned on the fly. Killing someone wasn't the hard part. Getting away with it was. There were no guides, no maps, just instinct, fear, desperation, and maybe some prayer. Poison? Sure. If you didn't mind rolling the dice. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just made your target vomit and get angrier. Worst case? You drank the wrong cup. There was no hotline, no manual. Just plans, guts, and guesses. If someone more experienced taught you something, like how to walk across cobblestones without a sound, consider yourself lucky. But don't expect a mentorship. Assassins didn't retire. They just disappeared. Their only legacy was silence. And the gear? Forget everything video games told you. No hidden blades. No enchanted weapons. You used what you could steal or craft. A knife without rust was already high-end. If your weapon smelled like old sweat, it came with a story. Poison wasn't elegant. It was a foul-smelling mix of herbs, bugs, and hope. Kills were up close, messy, physical. There was no time for acrobatics. One clean strike. Get out fast. If your blade failed, you improvised a rock, a belt buckle, a roofing nail. Anything that could be hidden inside bread was a weapon. And still, you did it for money. For that coin. Heavy, loud, and real. For promises that rarely held up. Because whoever hires an assassin doesn't like leaving loose ends. Sometimes they gave you half up front, if you were lucky. The other half came later, if you left no mess, no witnesses, and no trail. But often, they vanished. Or worse, they sent someone to tie up loose ends, and that someone was sent for you. A knife in your back was cheaper than the second payment. And even when they paid, it was never enough for what you gave up. Your safety, your soul, your humanity. Some contracts were traps. You thought you were eliminating a corrupt noble, but you were walking into a setup. A political scheme. A rope with your name already hanging on the gallows. There was no one to complain to. No court to appeal to. What were you going to do? File a lawsuit. The only trial waiting for you was trial by rope. So you learned to trust no one. Get paid up front. And vanish the second things smelled too easy. Being an assassin meant living off broken promises, running at night, and keeping a silence that eventually swallowed your name. Because if you talked, it wasn't just your life you risked. It was every poor soul who might pick up the blade after you. Retirement plan. There were no updates. No gear upgrades between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You just prayed it wouldn't betray you mid-attack, because in the end, it wasn't the blade that did the killing. It was you. Alone. Under-equipped. Expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to stab drunks in alleys. No one paid you to shank Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were nobles, bishops, military officials, sometimes even royalty. And those people were very hard to kill. First, the guards. Not one or two. Dozens. Armed, armored, well-fed. Some guarded the doors. Others stood in back. Some just loitered, glaring at anyone who dared blink too fast. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, creaky floorboards, and exactly how many stairs it took before your lungs needed a break. Then, the walls. Castles didn't have front porches. They had murder holes and moats filled with bitey things. If you didn't drown, you still had to dodge arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil was part of the job description. Third, the staff. Cooks, scribes, stable boys. One suspicious glance, and they'd whisper your fate to the captain of the guard faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords. They were fighting gossip. And medieval gossip traveled at light speed if it meant keeping your own head attached. Then came the target. Paranoid, and rightly so. Surrounded by traitors. Relatives with claims to their title. Dozens of courtiers pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a taster. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even used decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly game of musical chairs. And don't get excited when you hear they're attending a feast. Yes, they'll be drunk. But so will you. And you still have to pass royal guards, 3 dogs, 1 disturbingly alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding torchlight. Even getting near your mark could take weeks. Disguising as a servant, bribing a maid, hiding in barrels. And when the moment came, you had 1 shot. Perfect. Precise. Silent. Or you'd become tomorrow's public decoration, swinging at the gate with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest. When you imagine a medieval assassin, you think sleek black robes, leather straps, maybe a hood fluttering in moonlight. Reality. You looked like a sick goat herder with secrets. Disguises weren't fashionable. No tailored cloaks or retractable armor. Just whatever you could scrounge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the leftover uniform of a guard that still smelled like its last owner. The goal was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old wounds, and twitched from malnutrition. You weren't suspicious because of your cloak. You were suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cloth. Forget masks. There were no face fork options. Most face coverings made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding small talk, but terrible for sneaking into noble parties. If someone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I do silent prayer and roof maintenance. Even if you got past the guards, noble houses weren't full of fools. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones fumbling with chamber pots and forgetting the cook's cat's name. More than once, you were a "Hey, I've never seen you before" away from a candelabra to the face. If your disguise worked, congrats. Now you had to stay in character for hours, pretending not to notice the far too steady people wandering around. And no, wigs didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck rubbing dirt on your face, squinting, and praying nobody noticed your beard was glued on with honey. Your disguise didn't protect you. It bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to vanish or be very convincing. And if someone saw through it? Well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a holiday. In the medieval age, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. No helpful archer. No clever alchemist. No handler sending coded scrolls and motivational speeches. You had a rusty dagger and paralyzing trust issues. There were no guilds, not ones you could rely on. If whispers of a brotherhood of assassins existed, they were mostly tavern tales spun by people like me and fueled by boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional who wanted to network. Because in your line of work, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk. Every loose tongue, a trap. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your retirement. Friends, laughable. They asked too many questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and your habit of sleeping with a blade under the pillow. You couldn't relax. You couldn't afford to. One mistake. One person recognizing you at the market, and suddenly your life was a sprint to the nearest sewer grate. Even criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You made people disappear. They were scared of you, or worse, saw you as walking liability. Nobody wanted to share stew with the guy whose job might summon an angry mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you spoke about your work, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous, and they weren't wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always on the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed 2 nights. You never gave your name unless they paid you first, and even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of disappearing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never had. Witchcraft and reputation. He could curse a baby just by looking at it. Even his tools were suspect. The dagger he carried? Clearly forged in a cursed forge. The poison he used? That wasn't chemistry, that was witchcraft. You probably mixed it under a blood moon, whispering over a severed toe. You'd think fear would protect you, that people would avoid you. But the truth was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw rocks. They light fires. They scream things like, "Burn him before he summons lightning." Your reputation made people exaggerate. The moment someone died, unexpected illness, freak accident, a bone stuck in their throat, Someone whispered. Maybe it was the Shadow Man. Maybe it was him. You could be hunted simply for living in the same village as a suspicious death. So, you had to keep moving. Always. Stay too long, and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell. And 5 angry farmers show up with pitchforks. Like they've been waiting their whole lives for a reason to use them. And God help you if you were caught carrying anything remotely odd. Dried herbs, strange coins, or worse, a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout, "Witch!" and set something on fire. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces. Being too quiet, too clever, or too quick made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die. Quickly. Preferably by fire. Poison, the assassin's elegant weapon. A silent death. No mess. No screams. No steel against bone. Just a sip. A stagger. A breath, and silence. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a tavern brawl with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First of all, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have access to refined cyanide or convenient pills labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional cursed toad. You had to gather them, grind them, and pray. And even then, all it might do is give your target a stomachache and a new appreciation for their bodyguard. There were no measurements. You didn't dose scientifically. You guessed. 1 pinch too much, and you dropped dead before the appetizer was served. Medieval kitchens? Chaos. You couldn't just walk in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe someone. Disguise yourself as a cook. Sneak past 20 servants. Or worse, try to poison a dish that would be tasted by 3 people and a dog before it reached the noble. Yes, a dog. And if your mark was a noble, meals weren't food. They were military operations. Everything was sniffed, blessed, poked, and examined by everyone from the butler to the court jester. By the time the dish reached the table, it had survived more scrutiny than a royal wedding. Even if you did get the poison in, even if no one noticed, and even if your target actually ate it, the aftermath was chaos. Some poisons took hours. Some days. 1 minute they're laughing at a joke. The next, they're clutching their gut and asking to see their astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they blamed? Not the cook. Not the taster. You. The quiet man with herbal knowledge and nervous eyes. Poison wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you wouldn't get a quick death. You'd be interrogated. With tools. Until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to his dog. No glory, no legacy. You'd think if you succeeded, if you changed the course of history, removed a tyrant, silenced a political threat, someone would remember your name. But no, you were an assassin. That meant your name shouldn't be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, a hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, the quiet man who never finished his ale. You could pull off the most legendary hit of the century, and still end up as Mysterious Death in the official record. And that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew your name, the safer they were. And the less likely they were to end up poisoned by you. So your name was buried the moment the job was done. You didn't sign your work. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't exist outside the kill. If anyone knew your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had very short lifespans. No retirement. No peace. Forget honor. There were no medals for silence. No stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with a dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they ordered one, for themselves. You got a wooden box. Or, if things went poorly, a pike with your head on it labeled traitor. Sometimes, your name was remembered only so it could be cursed. You became a warning whispered at court. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yeah. And the man who did it? He vanished like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame. Not fear. Just absence. You weren't meant to leave a mark. You were meant to disappear. And if you stuck around long enough to be known, that was a fatal mistake. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were erased. The final betrayal. Let's say you survived. The deaths. The lies. The poisonings. The betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own morality. Now what? Retire? Absolutely not. Because in the medieval world, assassins didn't retire. There were no goodbyes. No feasts. No quiet seaside cottages. No pensions paid in gold and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished. Or died. Often both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You had too many secrets in your head. Too many names in your memory. Too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one came after you, and that was a big if, you lived with the constant fear that someone might. That some young assassin, just like you once were, was already sharpening steel and memorizing your face. Eager to prove yourself, you had just taken a contract on a shadowy figure, someone who had once been dangerous. So you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You limped for show. You sold herbs. You lied and said you'd once worked as a guard. But still, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept a dagger beneath the floorboards, next to the coin pouch you never touched, because it still smelled of the man you had outsmarted. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and fast escapes had rewired your brain. Every knock at the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize your face. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth is, there was no endgame for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fading into obscurity. Always moving. Always watching. Until one day, you slipped in the dark, and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even that cool. It was a short, grim, thankless career wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by a trail of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions. That you'd be elegant, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd actually be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the gallows. You'd enter a town with your cloak drawn tight, ready for action, only to find your target had moved. The guards are drunk, but the stable boy you bribed for information just sold you out for a mug of beer and a crust of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong moment, stab the wrong man, be seen by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel. And suddenly, you're no longer a shadow, you're the problem. So you run. But you're not used to medieval terrain. The mud. The uneven cobblestones. The absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the streets. You slip. You fall. You get tackled by a guard named Thomas, who just got dumped and is looking for a win. And say you survive that. Then comes the aftermath. No allies. No honor. No future. Just whispers of suspicion and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try. Because the life of an assassin wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spit out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace, and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one would even remember you were there. Before she was the feared queen of Macedon, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a princess of the rugged Molossian tribe from the wild lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and if the blood of heroes truly ran through her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the edges of history. From an early age, Myrtale was immersed in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not only by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the old gods. She wasn't the kind of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to the omens of snakes and the frenzied ceremonies of Dionysian cults, where women danced barefoot beneath the moonlight and summoned the divine in trance-like states. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative. It was personal. She didn't just worship, she embodied. According to ancient sources, likely written by men both terrified and fascinated by her, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even let them coil beside her in bed. Whether that was literal truth or the kind of slander powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know. But the legend stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her true power didn't begin in a battlefield or a throne room, but in the flickering torchlight among whispering priestesses and the coiling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously impulsive, arrived on the island of Samothrace for a sacred initiation ritual, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He encountered a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the beginning, it was laced with omens. Some said lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain, the union of Olympias and Philip didn't just produce a child. It gave the world Alexander the Great. And from the very start, Olympias meant to shape his destiny. Their marriage was far from a fairy tale. From the beginning, it was a volatile blend of prophetic pride and royal paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was probably just a teenager. But she was no innocent. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition matched her own, and perhaps even a divine counterpart to her spiritual destiny. Macedon was no easy realm. It was a land of iron and ambition, where kings were killed by cousins and brothers turned into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Papyrus, entered with her head high and her eyes already on the crown. The marriage was turbulent from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, sometimes for alliances, always for power, but Olympias was not the type to sit quietly in the shadows. She kept her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to consult oracles and perform rites to foresee her future, and perhaps Philip's. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that was cloaked in divine drama. Legends say Olympias dreamed of a lightning bolt striking her womb and that flames danced around her infant son without burning him. Philip supposedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or fabricated them, they acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This wasn't just a domestic issue. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be seen as more legitimate in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's claim. Olympias understood something many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival's child, no matter how small, is a future war. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, Olympias turned to securing Alexander's throne. Her son, bold, brilliant, and already trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But make no mistake, it wasn't just his charisma or Philip's legacy that made this possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting Alexander's rise, she was orchestrating it. Alexander didn't always approve. He likely disapproved of the violence done to Cleopatra's family. But he didn't stop it either. Because deep down, he knew what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedonia, bloodlines were both blessing and curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to withdraw from public life, but not into retirement. She merely shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. While Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, Olympias remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals in his name. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't merely military, it was divine. Alexander wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she breathed, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail the divine plan she had crowned him to fulfill. She had cleared the palace. Now, she would defend his empire from behind the curtain, with her teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedonia, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but don't be fooled. She ruled in everything but name. Though regency had technically been entrusted to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote to her son constantly, advising, warning, even chastising him. These were not the tender letters of a loving mother. They were political briefings, dripping with oracles and venom. Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She scorned his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his flirtation with being called a god. No one else dared say these things. But Olympias had never feared speaking as a mother, or a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedonia, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympias undermined him at every step. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir opposition. She held influence in Epirus, Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. Her whispers could spread like wildfire. And with Olympias, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She painted Antipater as a second Philip, ready to betray, to usurp. Whether she truly believed it or simply feared losing control, she pushed her son to act. But Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to keep order in Greece while he waged war in Asia. And so, the rift between mother and general widened. Olympias watched. She waited. But under her priestly robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She had not survived years of palace warfare to be ruled by an old soldier. Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India. Olympias saw the cracks forming. He was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting from the mother and the gods who had raised him. She believed his victories came from divine favor. And from her. If he forgot, Olympias knew how to remind kings who they truly were. Even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death reached Macedonia in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a trumpet. It came like a dagger. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and fast escapes had rewired your brain. Every knock at the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize your face. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth is, there was no endgame for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fading into obscurity. Always moving. Always watching. Until one day you slipped in the dark, and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even that cool. It was a short, grim, thankless career wrapped in blood-stained linen and followed by a trail of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions. That you'd be elegant, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd actually be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the gallows. You'd enter a town with your cloak drawn tight, ready for action, only to find your target had moved. The guards are drunk, but the stable boy you bribed for information just sold you out for a mug of beer and a crust of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong moment, stab the wrong man, be seen by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel. And suddenly, you're no longer a shadow, you're the problem. So you run. But you're not used to medieval terrain. The mud. The uneven cobblestones. The absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the streets. You slip. You fall. You get tackled by a guard named Thomas, who just got dumped and is looking for a win. And say you survive that. Then comes the aftermath. No allies. No honor. No future. Just whispers of suspicion and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. Olympias saw it clearly. The palace wasn't a home, it was a battlefield. And she would use every ritual, every snake dream, every whisper she had to ensure her son was not just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtale. She was Olympias now, and no one would take the throne from her son without facing her wrath. By the time Alexander, so no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try. Because the life of an assassin wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spit out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace, and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one would even remember you were there. Before she was the feared queen of Macedon, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a princess of the rugged Molossian tribe from the wild lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself, and if the blood of heroes truly ran through her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the edges of history. From an early age, Myrtale was immersed in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not only by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites and a reverence for the old gods. She wasn't the kind of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to the omens of snakes and the frenzied ceremonies of Dionysian cults, where women danced barefoot beneath the moonlight and summoned the divine in trance-like states. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative. It was personal. She didn't just worship, she embodied. According to ancient sources, likely written by men both terrified and fascinated by her, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even let them coil beside her in bed. Whether that was literal truth or the kind of slander powerful women attract like flies, We'll never know. But the legend stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her true power didn't begin in a battlefield or a throne room, but in the flickering torchlight among whispering priestesses and the coiling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously impulsive, arrived on the island of Samothrace for a sacred initiation ritual, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He encountered a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the beginning, it was laced with omens. Some said lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just produce a child. It gave the world Alexander the Great. And from the very start, Olympias meant to shape his destiny. Their marriage was far from a fairy tale. From the beginning, it was a volatile blend of prophetic pride and royal paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was probably just a teenager. But she was no innocent. She saw in Philip a man whose ambition matched her own, and perhaps even a divine counterpart to her spiritual destiny. Macedon was no easy realm. It was a land of iron and ambition, where kings were killed by cousins and brothers turned into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Papyrus, entered with her head high and her eyes already on the crown. The marriage was turbulent from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, sometimes for alliances, always for power, but Olympias was not the type to sit quietly in the shadows. She kept her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to consult oracles and perform rites to foresee her future, and perhaps Philip's. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that was cloaked in divine drama. Legends say Olympias dreamed of a lightning bolt striking her womb and that flames danced around her infant son without burning him. Philip supposedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or fabricated them, they acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This wasn't just a domestic issue. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be seen as more legitimate in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's claim. Was a teenager. The royal palace in Pella had become a war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't just fighting for influence. She was fighting for survival. She knew the court was full of snakes, but she was the one who had taught them to bite. Philip began to distance himself. He campaigned more, drank more, and, perhaps worst of all, he listened more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, this wasn't just betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The wedding ceremony was a disaster. At the feast, a drunken Attalus mocked Olympias and Alexander, questioning Alexander's legitimacy. Was he really Philip's son? Or was he the child of a god, as Olympias liked to claim? It was meant as an insult. But Olympias clung to the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. That made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the banquet in fury. Olympias left Macedon altogether, retreating fully to Epirus. If you'd like this text formatted as a script, narrated prose, or video voiceover, I can help adapt it. Even as she moved, Olympus still coiled within her, ready to strike. Years later, as Alexander's empire crumbled into civil war, Olympias made her boldest move yet. She returned to Macedonia, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force. Her exile had not been a defeat, it had been a strategy. In her homeland, she was still royalty. She could whisper into ears, gather support, and watch as Philip's palace began to rot from the inside. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. And then came the shockwave. King Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he prepared to invade Persia, just as he was poised to crown himself not only king of Macedonia but future emperor of the known world. The question that echoed through marble halls and torchlit chambers was always the same. Who did it? Pausanias, the discarded bodyguard who committed the murder, was only the blade. Was this the result of court intrigue? Did Alexander himself play a role? Or was it the whispers of Olympias? No one could prove it. No one dared. But many believed. Especially when, just days later, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Some said Olympias had them killed. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip gone and Macedonia wrapped in confusion and mourning, Olympias struck. While others reeled, she moved swiftly, brutally, and decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and Olympias' rival, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't just have her killed. She made her death symbolic, public, humiliating. Some said Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her daughter murdered. Others claimed Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What is agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood something many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival's child, no matter how small, is a future war. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, Olympias turned to securing Alexander's throne. Her son, bold, brilliant, and already trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But make no mistake, it wasn't just his charisma or Philip's legacy that made this possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting Alexander's rise, she was orchestrating it. Alexander didn't always approve. He likely disapproved of the violence done to Cleopatra's family. But he didn't stop it either. Because deep down, he knew what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedonia, bloodlines were both blessing and curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to withdraw from public life, but not into retirement. She merely shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. While Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, Olympias remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals in his name. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't merely military, it was divine. Alexander wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she breathed, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail the divine plan she had crowned him to fulfill. She had cleared the palace. Now, she would defend his empire from behind the curtain, with her teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedonia, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but don't be fooled. She ruled in everything but name. Though regency had technically been entrusted to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote to her son constantly, advising, warning, even chastising him. These were not the tender letters of a loving mother. They were political briefings, dripping with oracles and venom. Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him who his true enemies were. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She scorned his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his flirtation with being called a god. No one else dared say these things. But Olympias had never feared speaking as a mother, or a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedonia, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympias undermined him at every step. She used her status, her religious authority, and her family ties to stir opposition. She held influence in Epirus, Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. Her whispers could spread like wildfire. And with Olympias, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She painted Antipater as a second Philip, ready to betray, to usurp. Whether she truly believed it or simply feared losing control, she pushed her son to act. But Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to keep order in Greece while he waged war in Asia. And so, the rift between mother and general widened. Olympias watched. She waited. But under her priestly robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She had not survived years of palace warfare to be ruled by an old soldier. Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India. Olympias saw the cracks forming. He was taking on too much, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting from the mother and the gods who had raised him. She believed his victories came from divine favor. And from her. If he forgot, Olympias knew how to remind kings who they truly were, even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death reached Macedonia in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a trumpet. It came like a dagger. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of the world she had spent decades building. Her son, the divine storm she had prophesied, had risen and raged, but left no clear skies behind. No heir. No successor. Only chaos. The mighty empire he carved was already fragmenting. His generals, his so-called successors, were already dividing it like jackals around a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedonia and Greece. And he had no love for Olympias. Worse still, Alexander's sister Cleopatra was being courted by rival generals for marriage. Each one hoped to use her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias saw what was coming. Civil war wasn't a possibility. It was inevitable. And once again, she would have to act. But this time, she no longer had a son. What she had was a legacy. Alexander IV, her grandson, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Macedonia was vulnerable, and the boy was even more so. But Olympias recognized. The child was now the last living piece of her son's legacy. That made him a target, but also a weapon. She allied with Roxana and the child, determined to protect them and use the boy's birthright to reclaim her power on the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The generals who had once bowed before Alexander had no intention of kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had armies now, ambitions, old grudges. Olympias did not flinch. She had faced serpents, traitors, and kings. She would not be cowed by warlords with stolen crowns and sharpened spears. So she planned. She waited. She watched as Antipater died, and was replaced by his son Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no patience for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces would collide, the serpent mother of Alexander, and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her buried. Alexander was gone, but his shadow, a divine fury, still loomed. The regency had been fragmented. Cassander, son of her old enemy Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana along with the young Alexander IV were effectively imprisoned. Olympia saw the writing on the wall. If she did not act now, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she made a pact with Polyperchon, the old general who still held a glimmer of legitimate authority. He would not return to Olympus to beg, but to govern. With Polyperchon's support, she marched into Macedonia at the head of an army. The moment her feet touched her native soil, everything changed. Cities opened their gates, soldiers deserted to her side, even some of her old enemies hesitated. Despite her age, Olympia was still a name that shook the ground beneath their feet. Then came her revenge. One by one, she hunted down those loyal to Cassander. And when she finally caught the mentally ill Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's disabled half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the chance to take her own life. When she refused, Olympus strangled her. It was a veiled brutality in royal protocol, and Olympus always theatrically staged the scene as a goddess dispensing justice. Her message was clear: only Alexander's bloodline had the right to rule. All others were impostors. For a brief burning moment, Olympia held the kingdom in her hands. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She reminded Macedonia what real power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedonia was like fire on dry grass, and Cassander was still out there, calculating, waiting for the right moment. He returned with vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources were deeper, his cruelty colder, and his allies began abandoning Polyperchon. The tide turned. Olympia, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched her enemies approach. She had lit the match that Macedon had burned, and now the smoke was thick as her enemies stood at Olympus' gates. Once the most feared woman in the ancient world, she now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone and surrounded by Cassander's army, sent to finish what his father had started. But Olympia did not beg. She did not plead. For almost a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran out. Disease set in. Allies disappeared. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unshakable presence that once shook kings. Until the end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, always cautious, hesitated. He knew killing Olympia was dangerous. Even now, she carried a myth around her like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. Toppling her might seem like blasphemy. So he offered her safety. "Surrender," he said, "and your life will be spared." But Olympia knew better. She had seen many royal promises turn to ashes. Hunger was no longer mere discomfort, it was death. Her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered. And Olympia, unyielding to the end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander did not kill her. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he delivered her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They sentenced her to death. But here is the problem. When the executioners came, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympia stood tall, majestic, silent eyes fixed on them like an oracle looking through smoke. They were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They once cheered her son as a living god. And now here she was, an old, frail woman wrapped in myth. And no man had the courage to wield the sword. So Cassander sent others, foreigners from outside who had no memory of her power, only orders to obey. And so Olympus was finally brought down. Not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline in any significant power. And with her, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was extinguished. But even in death, Olympia left behind a shadow. History would never forget the Snake Queen. Olympia died not on a throne, but in dust, disarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. Yet history is strange. It does not always favor those who die in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who slither away. And Olympia was never made for a quiet story. In life, she wielded motherhood as a sword and prophecy as a shield. She was not just Alexander the Great's mother. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there was no myth of the divine child, no whispered rituals about lightning and lions, no ruthless purge of rivals that paved the way for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympia did not just give birth to an empire. She defended it with claws. Yet even among the most ruthless dynasties of the ancient world, Olympia stands out. She did not command armies on the field like Cleopatra or ride into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was more subtle and cold. It was a world of poison chalices, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear and, more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and perhaps she believed it too. Her enemies labeled her assassin, witch, manipulator, and they were not wrong. Olympia was all of that and more. She was a product of a brutal world that respected cunning far more than kindness. And she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she was vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no ancient or modern historian could call her irrelevant. She haunted Alexander's legacy like a ghost, always in the background, always behind the curtain. And perhaps that is exactly where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's history, but as a story in her own right. A woman who tangled with prophecies, slept beside snakes, and outlasted gods. Olympia's bones have long since turned to dust, but her legend endures in every tale of relentless queens, in every whisper of bloody destiny. In every empire built on myth, she is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting. On the sunny island of Crete, just a few kilometers south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a place. Corridors of stone snake off in every direction. Rooms spin and fold back on themselves. Stairs lead nowhere. It is easy to lose your sense of direction even today. This place is Knossos, the heart of Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was legend, there was a palace unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over the centuries, Knossos was not just a royal residence. It was an entire city under one roof. Spanning nearly 150,000 square feet, it featured over 1,000 rooms, light wells, storerooms, workshops, shrines, and what may have been the first flushing toilets in history. It had running water to multi-story apartments and an intricate air circulation system. This was no primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, it looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably seemed magical. The man who brought Knossos to modern consciousness was the British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced this was the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and wherever he turned, he found bull motifs painted on walls, carved in stone, or fashioned into tiny gold charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythical king Minos. Whether Minos was real or not, his legend became inseparable from the ruins. But here's the twist. No one found a literal labyrinth. No underground maze, no prison chambers, no half-man, half-bull monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately difficult to navigate. And the deeper you go, the more the lines between history and mythology blur. So the question remains whether the Minotaur was born from these walls, or if the palace itself was. The monster itself may not give us its answers easily, but it is very good at making us ask the right questions. The myth is as famous as the ruin of a half-man, half-beast trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered would ever find their way out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to kill the beast and escape thanks to a ball of thread and the cleverness of Princess Ariadne. Where did this story come from, and why a labyrinth in the earliest versions of the myth? The myth speaks of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded a tribute from Athens in the form of 7 boys and 7 girls every year. These unfortunate souls were fed to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and shame. The Minotaur, locked in an underground labyrinth, symbolized the dark side of power, something wild hidden beneath greatness. To the ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. Its maritime people, the Minoans, were seen as elegant and strange. Their rituals involved the destruction of their own artworks, depicted strange gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the mainland. To a Greek visitor around 1000 BC, Crete might have seemed like another world. The bull itself was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes show young men and women leaping over bulls in a ritualistic display. Bull horns were a symbol of consecration. Stylized bull horns appear on rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that resembles a labyrinth, and the ingredients for a legend begin to stir. But what if the Minotaur was not just a monster, but a metaphor? Some scholars believe the story reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over the Achaeans, a time when Athens actually paid tribute to a stronger foreign power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political trap of weaker states, and the Minotaur the terrible, raw force behind Minoan rule. Others argue the myth is more psychological, the labyrinth representing the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden impulses, and Theseus, the hero, bravely walking into the darkness guided only by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains entangled with Crete. The palace is the closest thing we have ever found to a real labyrinth. Not a monster, nor Ariadne, but perhaps something deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a story that demanded to become myth long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears. There was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. They ruled not through conquest, but through trade, art, and what seemed like a near-supernatural command of architecture. At the center of their power was Knossos, a palace that was not just a royal seat, but a center of culture, ritual, and economy. The Minoans flourished roughly from 2600 to 1400 BC. Based on Crete, they developed an extensive trade network reaching Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant coasts of Spain. Their ships cut through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, delivering pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods. They built no great armies, forging relationships rather than weapons. What is most impressive about Minoan culture is how different it was from later Greek successors. Their art celebrated nature, animals, and the fluid movement of the human body, not war or divine punishment. Frescoes show dancers, dolphins, and athletes leaping over bulls. Even their goddesses are different. Powerful figures with bare breasts, often holding snakes, symbols of transformation or fertility protection. At the heart of it all was Knossos, not a fortress on a hill, but a sprawling complex in a fertile valley. It lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected enough power to make defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. Multi-story buildings, colonized courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems showed a society far ahead of its time. And yet, despite all their sophistication, the Minoans left no deciphered written records. The primary linear A script remains unreadable to this day. We do not know what their kings believed, what prayers they spoke, or what truly happened behind the walls of Knossos. All we have are ruins, art, and their influence absorbed later by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just palace builders. They were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not just a building. It was the beating heart of a civilization that shone briefly like sunlight on the Aegean, then vanished. Yet some say its echo still wanders the labyrinth. To walk through Knossos is to walk through time in layers, beautiful, confusing time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you, it's the design. Rooms lead to rooms. Corridors split and disappear. Light wells cut through the building's core. Spiral staircases hide in shadows or suddenly emerge into sunlit courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. No wonder ancient visitors whispered that the labyrinth of Knossos was not just a palace but a living organism, sprawling across an estimated 150,000 square feet. The complex contained over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some vast. These were not randomly placed rooms. They were built for workshops, storage, shrines, apartments, and throne rooms, all organized around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bull rituals. The palace rose several stories high in places, using natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate without getting lost, you needed instinct, memory, or a guide like Theseus. Yet behind this apparent chaos hid remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open staircases. They channeled rainwater through clay pipes and had flushing toilets long before Rome made them fashionable. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for an alabaster seat built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of mythical griffin guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king? The chamber of a goddess? A sacred court? No one knows for sure. The walls speak in color. Vibrant frescoes show dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant tiered skirts with bare breasts, young bulls leaping in the air. The art was not mere decoration, it was identity. Fluid, natural, deeply connected to land and sea. The deeper you go, the more disorienting Knossos becomes. Some parts seem intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse. Perhaps that is the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that seemed alive, a building inviting awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts, just a place built to make you question where you were and what awaited around the next corner. Knossos was not merely an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul immersed in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there were no imposing columns for Zeus or marble sanctuaries for Athena. Instead, Knossos's spiritual world was woven subtly into the building itself. Shrines hid in corners. Pillars rose like sacred sentinels. Stylized bullhorns were carved into roofs and altars. Wherever you looked, the bull motif dominated, suggesting a powerful connection between reverence for the natural world and this sacred animal. The Minoans did not fear the bull, they celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco at Knossos is more than athletic art. It may represent a religious rite, young men and women vaulting over a charging bull in a dance of danger and grace. It was not sport. It was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses found in deposits beneath the palace. These figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-armed with snakes coiled in their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols but guardians of fertility, home, and possibly life itself. For the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery, creatures of the earth and underworld. The rooms where these objects were found suggest domestic shrines or quiet ritual spaces, sacred corners hidden in the bustling heart of the palace. Combined with the frescoes, horns, altars, and labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex looks like a ritual machine, a structure built not only to live in but to connect with the divine. There was no centralized temple in Knossos because the palace itself was a temple. Its art, layout, and design were part of a spiritual worldview where sacred and secular did not exist as separate realms. This was a place where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a passage to the gods, and where every echo in the stone chambers might have once been a whispered prayer. It housed not just people, but gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural sophistication. Then something happened. Something sudden, something no one can fully explain. Around 1400 BC, the palace was abandoned. The frescoes faded, and the Minoan civilization that once ruled the seas disappeared like mist over the Aegean. So what happened? Theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted in one of the largest explosions in human history. The blast was so massive it likely caused tsunamis that struck northern Crete's coast, devastating ports and farmland. Clouds may have blocked the sun, suffocating crops and disrupting climate. Though Knossos was not destroyed immediately, the eruption's consequences may have shaken the economic, political, and spiritual foundations of Minoan society. Others looked to war. Around 1450 BC, the rising power of the Mycenaeans on the mainland may have exploited Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests Knossos was briefly reoccupied, but the culture changed. Art became more martial. Linear A script was replaced by Linear B used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once flourished with snake god. The most iconic symbol, however, is the double axe or labris found in the sanctuaries of Knossos in frescoes, even carved in stones. It is believed that the double axe is a religious symbol, possibly linked to the female deity or celestial cycles. Some suggest that the very word labyrinth may derive from labris, implying that the labyrinth is not a maze but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. These may have been religious markers separating the sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent representations of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it is clear that the animal held deep spiritual significance. Whether it represented nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence, no one agrees. But the bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Knossos may have symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was built not only for function but to mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a journey through life, death, the underworld, a spiritual journey. The labyrinth is not a physical prison. But without a deciphered blueprint, every theory walks a fine line between perception and imagination. The Minoans spoke in symbols, not stories. And so we are left to interpret. What is Knossos telling us? We hear the rhythms. We see the images, but the meaning remains out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. It is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't seem dead. Walk through its corridors today and you will feel something buzzing just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not gods, but echoes of myths, lives, questions that refuse to leave. Thousands of years after its fall, Knossos still holds us in its labyrinth. Tourists wander its corridors, archaeologists dig for answers, and writers invent new stories inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the feeling of the labyrinth is real. We don't know who ruled Knossos. We don't know the names of its kings and queens or priests. We don't know the prayers they whispered or the laws by which they lived. But we know they loved beauty. We know they worshipped nature. We know they understood the balance between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew or Persian temples or palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may also have been a story. Because maybe that is what the labyrinth really is. Not a prison, not a puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architecture. The legend of the Minotaur didn't arise out of nowhere. It came from this place, the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who tried to make sense of it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology. But in its essence, Knossos has always been both. Today we can walk through its ruins in full daylight. We can take photos, draw maps, even reconstruct its frescoes. But the mystery hasn't disappeared. The line between fact and legend still glows like heat on stone. Perhaps that's why Gnosis endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history wasn't made to be solved. It was meant to be felt. And our ancient, half-remembered tangle is not just a place on a map. It's a question. One that leads us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we are all still following the thread. The ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. Early battering rams were portable. Teams of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and smashed it against enemy defenses like frenzied lumberjacks. But over time, battering ram engineers realized that mounting the ram inside a wheeled structure, often with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, transformed it from a tool into a weapon of terror. The Assyrian masters of siege warfare turned battering rams into weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with platforms for archers, meaning the city gates were being smashed while defenders were under constant fire. The relief sculptures of Nineveh show rams with spiked iron tips rolling up to rebellious city gates like slow gods of destruction. And it wasn't just the front door they were breaking. Rams were often used to breach weak points in walls, watchtowers, or completely collapsed gates. Their presence meant one thing: surrender or watch your defenses crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built massive battering rams called ares, Latin for ram, suspended with chains or ropes inside huge siege shelters. Some were so large they required dozens of men to operate. And the rhythm of their swinging beams sounded like thunder rolling over stone. Yet despite all their brute strength, battering rams required serious teamwork. Operators had to keep the ram swinging on target while defending it from flaming projectiles, stones, and all kinds of filthy substances thrown from above. A stopped ram was a dead ram. Still, once a ram started pounding, it really got going. Wooden muscle versus human masonry. It was ancient arm physics and just the beginning of how engineers would make walls weep. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the strategist. Where rams smashed up close, catapults attacked from a distance, throwing not only stones but psychological fear. They were the first real artillery pieces in military history. And they revolutionized siege warfare by turning physics into weapons in ways that seemed almost magical to the enemy. The first catapults appeared in the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, a product of brilliant minds who wanted to add range and power to warfare. Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse with a taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapult devices that used twisted bundles of silk or hair as tension springs. They were not slingshots for giants. They were precise instruments of siege terror. The genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly twisting ropes, usually made from animal sinew, they could store enormous amounts of potential energy. When released, this force could launch stones, darts, or even flaming projectiles hundreds of meters. Two main types quickly evolved: the ballista, which launched enormous arrows like a giant crossbow, and the catapult, which hurled stones over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers who never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve. They built catapults that could be disassembled, packed into carts, and reassembled on site, portable siege machines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible speeds, capable of tearing wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unlucky soldiers apart. Catapults were not just about destruction. They were about spectacle. Ancient generals used them to send messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and fear. Decapitated heads were thrown into besieged cities to destroy morale. In one chilling case, bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their drawbacks. They were heavy, required skilled crews, and could become useless in bad terrain. Yet when set up properly, they could bring a city to submission from a safe distance. For the first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls had to withstand more than just a battering ram. They had to survive the skies, because now destruction was flying. If the catapult was the cunning one, the trebuchet was majestic, imposing, creaking, and terrifying. It was the undisputed king of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it was not just a weapon, it was a statement. It said, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike their tension-powered cousins, trebuchets relied on gravity. At their core was a simple principle: a long swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Lift the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around, launching the sling and its deadly load in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The origin of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction models used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where manpower replaced counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly via Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. As soon as Europe got hold of the design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. The power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Furniture-sized stones smashed towers, pulverized walls, or destroyed enemy morale. But the real magic was in the sling. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could launch projectiles delicately over walls. That meant they weren't just destroying defenses, they were hitting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything from diseased animals to pots of burning pitch and lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped in rocks. A legendary account of the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland speaks of Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused to accept the surrender just to test the machine. But despite all its destructive glory, the trebuchet was not fast. It took hours to build, minutes to reload, and required skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval version of a slow-motion hammer falling from the sky. And when that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults fired from afar and battering rams broke gates, siege towers took a more personal approach. They rolled up to the enemy's front door and delivered armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels, covered with wet hides to resist fire, packed with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress in one. When one started roaring toward your city walls, you knew the real fight was about to begin. Siege towers were not subtle. They were big, bold, and terribly effective when used. The Assyrians may have been the first to employ them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, who pushed the design to theatrical extremes during the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE. The Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helepolis, or City Taker. It stood over 30 meters tall, was equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and operated by thousands of soldiers. It also collapsed under its own weight. But its ambition was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only work if you can't get over them. Siege towers eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could descend over battlements, bypass gates, and scale ladders. At the top, deck archers could rain death upon the defenders while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. But these towers were not invincible. They were slow, vulnerable to mud, and prime targets for defenders with flaming arrows, rolling stones, or even sabotaged terrain. Clever defenders would dig ditches to flood the bases of the towers or build secondary inner walls known as counterscarp defenses just to block the approach of a siege tower. And when they worked spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own wall suddenly packed with enemy soldiers was utter chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength into a vertical race for survival. They made height both an asset and a liability. And once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower onto the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand combat as battering rams smashed and trebuchets flew. Some of the most devastating siege tactics happened silently underground. Digging tunnels or sabotage was the dark art of defeating a city by removing the ground it stood on, literally. The idea was ancient and terrifyingly effective. Dig under the enemy's wall, support it with wooden beams, then set fire to those supports. When the wood burned away, the tunnel would collapse, taking the wall's foundation with it. This was the moment when a city's defenses faltered. A large section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method was not glamorous, no great engines or crashing towers, but tunnel digging was the slow and invisible killer of fortress warfare. The Assyrians practiced early versions, but the technique reached full maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans tried to tunnel under the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-dig, turning the soil into a nightmare of knife fights. This defensive tactic became known as countermining and added a terrifying element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in darkness hundreds of meters underground, listening for the sound of enemy picks. When they heard knocks, they rushed to intercept, often resulting in violent, claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, only terror, suffocation, and dirt. But when mining worked, the results were catastrophic. One infamous example occurred in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces dug a tunnel under the south wall, filled the mine with pig fat, and set it on fire. The supports burned away, collapsing the tunnel and bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were stunned and soon surrendered. By the 13th century, engineers became experts in identifying weak foundations, measuring soil behavior, and planning collapses with frightening precision. They were geologists and demolishers combined. Although tunnel digging required time, labor, and a bit of madness, it proved a vital truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall and couldn't break through it, you could always bring it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare came from attackers. For every battering ram built or tower rolled forward, defenders had their own deadly tricks, and sometimes those tricks were fiery. Let's start with the most terrifying of all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century AD, Greek fire was a mysterious substance similar to napalm that could stick to walls and flesh and kept burning even on water. Sprayed by siphons or thrown in clay pots, it created scenes of pure chaos. To this day, no one knows exactly how it was made. The formula was such a secret that it died with the empire, but its legendary effects remain. Entire fleets were reduced to blazing skeletons in minutes. And that was just the beginning. More low-tech defenses followed. Boiling liquids were preferred weapons. Water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, the small openings in gate or tower ceilings, directly onto invaders below. Oil was especially feared. Unlike water, which soaked into skin and armor, oil clung and spread flames relentlessly. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be greeted by fire you could never extinguish. Hot sand, though less dramatic, was cruel in its own way. It would slip through armor openings, especially around the neck or wrists, causing second- and third-degree burns by cooking the flesh beneath. From afar, it might not look impressive, but it turned brave warriors into screaming wrecks. Defenders also relied on good old physics. Gravity became a weapon. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from battlements onto siege machines or dense troop formations. The goal was not just to kill, but to break both machines and morale. Then there were hidden traps, pits, collapsing bridges, spike barricades. Castles became puzzles of pain designed to slow, confuse, and punish. Every minute a wall held meant a minute closer to enemy supply lines running dry, diseases spreading through camps, or reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a war of attrition. While attackers had physics on their side, defenders had creativity, and a lot of burning rage. Siege warfare's brutal destruction was only half the goal. The other half was psychological domination, breaking the defender's will before the walls fell. Siege weapons were not just tools of war, they were huge flaming symbols of destruction. Every creaking wheel of a siege tower, every arched stone launched by a trebuchet was designed to plant a seed of terror in those behind the walls. Ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians paraded their siege engines openly across deserts with great fanfare. The Romans built their siege camps in plain sight of the enemy, letting defenders watch as battering rams were assembled and catapults tested. Siege warfare was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes, the siege engines carried messages themselves. Heads of messengers or generals would be hurled over walls, sometimes still wearing their armor. During the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with stones but also with corpses. Diseased bodies were thrown to spread panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa around 1346, it's believed that launching plague-infected corpses over the walls helped trigger outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet was not just a weapon, it was an announcement. When one of these giants was brought into position, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before seeing it. The creaking of the pulleys, the snapping of ropes, the heavy thud of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. But the most dangerous part was the unknown. You never knew what would come next. A stone, a barrel of fire, a rain of arrows, or just a sinister silence as engineers adjusted their aim. Even sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic pounding of a battering ram or the sudden silence before a shot would drive defenders mad with anticipation. Commanders aimed to create despair, to convince the enemy resistance was useless, their gods had abandoned them, and their walls were mere temporary obstacles in the path of destiny. And when that final mental dam broke, gates often opened without a fight, because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind collapsed before the masonry. As gunpowder thundered across battlefields at the end of the medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines came to a slow and fragmented end. But their legacy did not vanish, it evolved. The invention of cannons changed everything. A single, well-aimed cannonball could do in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to accomplish. Stone walls once thought impenetrable became liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's great castles were falling, not to mines or fire, but to iron balls. Siege warfare entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. Yet the principles established by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is just a high-tech descendant of the same question. How do you break what should be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder entered history. Even modern military psychology, shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, and visible dominance, have roots in ancient siege tactics. Those massive siege machines advancing with flags snapping in the wind were the original shock and awe. They were not just about breaking a wall, they were about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still see their legacy carved into the ruins of ancient cities. Masada's Roman siege ramps still mark the desert. Layers of walls in Constantinople stood for 1,000 years against every imaginable machine until cannon fire finally brought them down, and castles across Europe tell stories through their round towers and angular bastions of a world constantly redrawing itself to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare has not disappeared, it has become digital. Cities are still besieged. Defenders remain isolated. The walls are now firewalls, blocks, or even media blackouts. But the soul of siege warfare remains the same. Someone wants in, someone wants to keep them out, and both are willing to wait, build, and break to win. Battering rams are gone. Trebuchets are museum pieces. But the spirit of siege warfare is as alive and destructive as ever.